Hey guys, and welcome to my project file for my latest single, Fernet. I'm going to be giving you a quick walkthrough. This song is out now on Enhanced Progressive, and I wanted to just give you a quick overview of how I built the song and just sort of some of the inspiration that I had when I wrote this. So before we begin, I guess it's probably good to mention that the way I have my project file set up is pretty typical, I guess, for this style of music. There's a lot of different groups and buses, as you can see here. One of the things that I really like doing is being able to group different elements together that belong in the same ballpark in terms of sound. So what I've done here is, for instance, I have this whole layer, which is just a bunch of basses that you can hear on the drop. So let's just go ahead and listen what that sounds like real quick for your ears. As you can hear there's a lot of stuff going on, and one thing that I like to do is I like to separate my subs from my second or third octave basses. Again, I always like to mention this, but this is a really cool trick that I learned from a good friend of mine, Lil Loretti. And basically what I like to do is I like to set up a sub bass that has just strictly a pure sine wave, another one that has kind of like a saw wave sort of style bass. And what this does is we're just able to attack the two different basses that are within the sub range of the frequency spectrum. So if we listen to the sub basses, they have this very significant but important sound for the low end. And then we listen to these basses over here, which is kind of like the second and third octaves. And when you put them together, they really sound full and big and gigantic, right? And let's dive in a little bit into what types of synths I'm using. So it looks like right here I have a Serum preset. Not exactly sure who made it. Okay, of course the man and the one and only Sunny Lax. And there's also a bass here, probably by Sunny Lax as well. There's a very good chance that I used his basses throughout a lot of this project. There's also a bass here by Kashmir. And there's an Oliver bass, I think. No, it's actually a Kashmir bass. So let's hear what those sound like individually. And essentially what each one of those basses are doing is just kind of layering on top of each other. As you can tell here, I have a lot of bare laces. And then I've also done a bunch of layers with some bass one-shots. So this was a bass from a sample that I think I just ended up chopping up in a different section, so we can listen to what that sounds like. Here's another one-shot bass. That just kind of adds like a little bit of a excitement of an element. Some things are muted here because I guess I did not end up using them. Here's another bass. And another one-shot bass. And what's interesting is that you may not be able to hear all these things when they're happening at the same time, but each one of them adds a little bit of character to the overall bass. I also have another section here that's called bass response, and I believe I named it that because these are sort of like the basses that are kind of playing on the offbeat. And that's exactly what they're doing. Then over here, I got some other elements that are interesting. I have like this VPS Avenger. I love using OTT, if you can see that right there. That's a tool that I love using because it just kind of adds a lot of character and brings out certain sounds out of a synth that you normally wouldn't be able to hear on its own. So let's go ahead and listen to what that VPS Avenger sounds like. And let's actually come a little bit closer right here. That was just like a really cool saw synth that I liked for that section. That was another VPS Avenger preset. And one little trick that I like to use whenever using OTT is I like to bring the downward all the way down. And I think what it does, from what I understand, is it just doesn't allow any sort of downward compression, but it is affecting the upward compression, which is giving it sort of like a massive Well, I'm not going to pretend like I know what it's doing because I don't, but I just want to say that it sounds cool. And if you play with these settings, especially the time setting, can really shape your sound. So, like, for instance, you were to play this at this section, as far as I understand, whenever I have the time on, it seems like the compression lasts longer, whereas when I have the time off, the compression isn't as long. That's just a lot cleaner. So let's go ahead and move on to the next section, which is the second part of this drop one. And this is kind of where the song kind of starts taking off and showing some of its, I guess it's wearing the sleeves on its shoulder at this point, right? It's starting to transition from like, that generic repeating pattern. Well, not generic, but that pattern that we heard earlier. And then now it's moving into like a progression. So let's go ahead and listen to what that sounds like. And essentially what I'm doing there is I'm just trying to bridge the gap between what's going to happen in the bridge and the main drop, or as I like to call it, the chorus, because traditionally I'm a songwriter, and that's just how I like to call my sections: verses, choruses, bridges, etc. And what I'm doing here is I'm moving away from this sort of singular pattern and then going into like a different chord progression that is teasing what's going to be happening in the breakdown. So let's go ahead and check out some of the elements I added here. I went ahead and separated these basses that are just sort of like the electro-ish basses, and then I replaced them with some basses that are a little bit more playful. Another important part of this section too is there's a rolling bass that starts happening that just kind of builds up the energy a little bit and gives you a little bit more room to dance. And another thing I did over here was start introducing these really cool chords. Sorry, these little arpeggios that start coming in. And then over here, there's some other chords that are happening. Oh, actually, I don't think I used these. These are muted. I think the ones that I did use were these. Yeah, exactly. So what I've done here is I've used an omnisphere, and what I've done is I've played with the arpeggiator, I believe. If I didn't do that, then it's written in the MIDI notes. It's hard to remember sometimes when I go back into these project files and start diving in and looking for specifics. But yeah, it looks like what I did is I had a preset called Pop Synco Pluck, and just created a little arpeggiating pattern that is at a 16th. And it just adds sort of like this nice playfulness to the track, right? Let's go ahead and play that back. And it just kind of adds some movement, keeps it from being too stagnant all the way through, and it introduces a new idea into the song that hopefully gets people excited. The next thing that I did in this section was adding some vocal effects. So this vocal chop, if I recall correctly, what I had done before is I had recorded it from a vocal sample and I chopped it up quite a bit, which unfortunately, I wish I would have saved that so you could see it. But what I originally done was, go into this sample, and what I did was I would just chop up a bunch of different little pieces. Matter of fact, I can kind of give you an example of what that would look like. But what I like to do is I like to grab a vocal sample, and with that vocal sample, I'll find the spots that I think are interesting or that I think have some potential to become a vocal shot. And in this case, I'm just going to use an acapella, not one that I've actually used on this track, but just another one just to kind of showcase a little bit of how I approach doing vocal chops and stuff. But if there was a section of this whole vocal that I really, really liked, what I would normally do is I'd start listening to it and then I would just start chopping it up, doing things like this, dragging this one piece here, maybe another section over here, and then maybe another section over here, and then just try to start splicing them together and just finding, like, what actually works, what doesn't. And from there, this process can sometimes be really quick, and sometimes it can take me hours to get the perfect exact vocal sample that I want. In the case of this one, it probably took me quite a bit of time, because sometimes what I'll be doing too is I'll go into like one of these specific samples, I'll warp it, and then I might pitch it up or down until I get the right sort of melody or tone that I'm trying to do. And I remember with this song, it was really a case of nailing down that specific melody. And with that melody, I believe what happened is it became part of the overall song. And I think actually it might be here. Oh, okay. So I actually do have the vocal chop, so that's great. So, each one of these is a different vocal chop that was sliced in the way that I was just showing you. And what I ended up doing was, coming up with a pattern that just, had all of these in one take. So let's go ahead and listen to that. It's probably not too much different from what you heard before, but... And from there, I believe what I did is, there was some automation that was done with a few different effects, just to kind of give the vocal some playfulness, to let it not be too stagnant. All right, so now that we've covered some of those vocal chops, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other elements of the song. So let's go ahead and check out the breakdown. So a note about breakdowns is, I think I've mentioned this before in a few other videos that I've done, but for me, breakdowns are typically some of the hardest ones, or some of the hardest sections to nail down, just because of the fact that breakdowns are, especially on the dance floor, they can be a very emotional point for people, and it can also be a moment where you can really give people a specific feeling. And whenever that breakdown comes in, I think it's always important to be intentional with what you're trying to convey. I think in this case, the song was becoming very, very energetic, and it was becoming very, very heavy. And so just the ability to let people kind of take a breather for a little bit, I think, was sort of the goal. Sometimes I have breakdowns that are a lot more aggressive and that have more percussion going on. But I think in this case, I really wanted it to kind of just slow down so that people had a moment to breathe, and then, be ready for that drop. And, some of the things that I did was to incorporate, just some nice chords, using a really nice pad, some other, sort of like dead mousey kind of chords. And as you can see here, I'm a big fan of layering, so I have a bunch of instances of the same thing happening at once, but each synth is kind of adding to the whole wall of sound in that case. So let's go ahead and check out this section, this second part of the bridge. And as you can see here, we're already like starting to build up pretty quickly, right? I actually created a separate drum group just to kind of get this section going. I had 4 white noise risers kind of happening at the same time. And, I'm a big believer that, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do this. Obviously you can probably do it with one thing. You can do it with multiple ones. I think the goal at the end of the day is to be able to achieve the feeling and the sound that you're looking for without worrying too much about, am I adding too many layers or this or that, unless you hear any major issues. There isn't really a whole lot to worry about in that situation. On these groups over here, I got some more long fills, a lot of crashes, uplifters. And my session does not like that. Yeah, so sometimes these tracks can get pretty heavy in terms of CPU and the amount of synths I'm using. I mean, obviously there's 301 tracks on this. I mean, not every track is being used, but there's definitely a lot going on, and it's one of those things where you have to make some compromises sometimes. You might need to freeze or flatten some tracks so that you can convert them into WAV files and still play them. But for the most part, I think if you know what synths you're using that don't use a lot of CPU, sorry, you can get away with having a lot of synths. So as I mentioned before, the vocal kind of was the driving factor of what the melody would become in the drop, and that was really a happy accident. I didn't really know exactly if I wanted to have a melody or not over the chorus or over the drop, whatever you want to call it. But the vocal melody inspired me to write that specific riff, and so that's what I did. I basically have a bunch of different pianos going on here. There's some Nexus ones, there's a Contact one, another Nexus one, and that's sort of like a saw lead that just kind of gives the pianos a little bit more energy and a little bit more ambience. Some more pianos and more pianos, and then finally some saw synths. And all those to create a wall of sound that just makes the drop sound nice and pretty. On the basses, just some nice easy basses that just kind of add some low end weight. Another more mono styled bass to kind of even out some of the stereo on the the stereo spectrum. I think one important thing to note about tracks like these is that it's very easy to get carried away with the stereo, and so whenever you're working with low end, it's nice to have a little bit of width, but it's also nice to have something very centered that isn't taking up too much of the stereo image of your entire track. And so I like to have a few groups of basses that are a little bit more stereoed, and then I like to have some of the ones that are a little bit more mono, just to kind of allow for especially for club speakers that can sometimes be dual mono or whatever. You kind of want those to really hit people right in the center instead of it being too spread out. And then on the effects, not really a whole lot going on here. There's just a bunch of crashes, a lot of white noise. And some more samples. And yeah, sure, when the second part of the drop comes in, there's more percussion, there's more hi-hats coming in right here. A lot of different loops. I love using the Xfer loops. Those are like the old Deadmau5 sample packs that he made. And yeah, I mean, that pretty much about covers it. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Or this little walkthrough that I did for my track Fernet. It's out now on Enhanced Music. Be sure to check it out. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. Have a great one.